George Galloway.
And I'm Adam Gary.
And together we are the History Boys. Every week looking at issues and events and people who made the historical moment that we are now in. Because if we don't understand how we got here, we sure as hell will never work out how to get out of here. Today we're looking at forgotten conflicts. Conflicts which were extremely significant at the time, have an enduring significance today, but for some reason, deliberate or accidental, have slipped really rather far from popular consciousness. We'll be focusing on the conflict in Aden, which was supposed to be Britain's last imperial battle. That was in the 1960s. We'll be looking at the interference, the coup d'etat, the civil conflict, and the divisions which Britain and the United States introduced to Iran, which continue to play out today, even though most people involved are forgotten, and the British and American role is carefully, artfully concealed, and one or two other things depending on the time. So, Adam, let's kick off with Aden. In the swinging 60s, Carnaby Street, Mary Quant, the mini-skirt, the mini-car, the Beatles, and Britain was still gunning down Arabs in Aden. Aden is part of Yemen, the major port in Yemen. Yemen is, for some reason, back in the news. Tell us how we got here.
Well, we got here initially in the 1870s when the very important port city of Aden became all the more important because it's very close in terms of geographical proximity to the Suez Canal, the Anglo-French project, later, much later, to be nationalized by General Nasser in Egypt.
And the cause of a very big war in itself.
Indeed, a war that isn't forgotten, but the lessons of it very much forgotten,
Definitely.
as are the lessons of most of the conflicts that we're going to discuss. So Britain took control of Aden, which is in the port city in the southwestern part of the Arabian Peninsula, what later formed South Yemen and what today forms the part of Yemen where President Hadi claims legitimacy, where a southern movement...
He's the Saudi-backed.
He's the Saudi-backed, and the UAE is backing a different faction, the southern movement, and then in the northwest of Yemen, we've got Houthi rebels who were once allied with long-serving President Saleh, who was assassinated last year. That's the present, but let's rewind and figure out how we got into this global quagmire that is fulminating there. Going into the 20th century, Britain organized Aden as part of the British Raj. So for much of the 20th century, Aden was ruled by decree from the Governor General sitting in India. And the rest of the hinterlands around Aden, the areas that we later knew as South Yemen, were eventually, by the mid-century, reorganized into something called the Federation of South Arabia. And this is where things start to begin to turn like a screw. The northern part of Yemen was an independent kingdom, putatively independent, but in reality it was very close to the British Empire, very close to the Saudi royal family, and there was a Republican revolution in the north, which began in 1962. This came shortly after the collapse of the United Arab Republic, which saw Syria and Egypt unite, and so in that context, it was Egypt's chance to reassert its republicanism in an important part of the Arab world.
And Nasser supported this rising.
Very much so. And the British mercenaries that fought in the north of Yemen to suppress the Republicans, the Nasserists, in support of the king, they gave a bit of a prelude, a kind of preview of coming attractions to what would happen in South Arabia just 1 year later. That's when all hell broke loose. The Radfan uprising, what's more commonly known as the Aden Emergency, began in 63.
And Britain sent actual troops to Aden. I recall them well. They were Scottish. They were led by a man called Mad Mitch, as I recall.
Indeed.
And I recall the bagpipes playing the Rocks of Aden and the swirl of the kilts as the Arab uprisers were gunned down.
Indeed, where in the North Britain sent its mercenaries, in the South it was a fully fledged imperial war. You can't even really say neo-imperial, because when you've
No,
got the bagpipes, the men in their khakis and the machine guns, it's fully fledged empire, in spite of the fact that it was as comparatively recently as the 60s. Now, the rebellion started as an outgrowth of a nationalist awakening that was spurred on by the Arab Trade Union Congress, which was very active in the Federation of South Arabia. This grew into two competing sets of guerrilla fighters, but with the time were fighting a common enemy, the British Empire. There was the NLF, the National Liberation Front, which was a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla group, and then there was a more Nasserist, still leftist, but not Marxist-Leninist group known as FLOSSY, which stands for, and get ready, it's one of these long acronyms, the Front for the Liberation of Occupied South Yemen. Now, it does sound a bit like the People's Front of Judea and the Judean People's Front, for those who recall the Monty Python reference, because both groups were progressive, both groups were radical, as they were classed by their supporters and by their opponents, and both had a common aim of establishing an independent state in the south of Yemen, a state which was actually, it formed in 1967.
This was the PDRY, the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen.
Very much. That's what it was called, and it was the first, lost, the only Marxist-Leninist state in the Arab world. The Arab world is, of course, known for many progressive so-called dictatorships, many right-wing dictatorships, monarchies, and everything in between. And then, of course, there's Lebanon, which is none of those things. Lebanon's just Lebanon. And then, of course, you have occupied Palestine. But in all of this, the People's Democratic Republic of South Yemen was unique in that it was a Marxist-Leninist country. Backing up a bit before 67, though, a very important thing happened prior to the state becoming a sovereign entity. In 1967, Egypt, along with the other powers in the Arab world, the established Arab world, went to war with Israel. This was the third prolific Arab-Israeli war, and as a result, the Suez Canal shut. This made it more difficult for Britain to continue the, frankly, war criminality in South Yemen, but what it also did is it made the territory slightly less valuable, because at that point there was no sign over the horizon indicating when the Suez Canal might reopen. A second important thing happened in that year. The Arab police, who from 1963 to the breakout of the 67 war between the Arabs and Israel, you had Arab policemen loyal to Britain, not to any of the nationalist movements fighting for the liberation of South Arabia, South Yemen. They switched sides during that war, and this was in many ways the straw that broke the camel's back, when you had policemen that were previously loyal to London, now loyal to their own Arab cause. So it's a strange phenomenon in Arab history that where there's plenty of reasons why the Arab street should be awakened, nationally minded, unity minded, that it frankly takes an Israeli crime to open these eyes, and that was very much the case in Yemen, and thus we had a divided Yemen starting in 67, civil war going on in the north, and a communist state in the south. Eventually, by 1970, the Republicans would win in the north, and while the two Yemens had relatively okay relations, nevertheless it would be until 1990 when Yemen would unite, and lo and behold, it might split again.
You say it would take an Israeli crime, but I've just been viewing footage of the Israeli national anthem carrying in the air of the Gulf state of the UAE, where a rabidly anti-Muslim Israeli minister was a guest of honor of the government of the UAE. The strains of the Israeli national anthem drowning out the cries of the children in Gaza, the cries of occupied Jerusalem. So there are many things still changing. Back to Yemen. The two Yemens reunite. Saleh, recently assassinated, becomes the leader of the whole country. with Houthi allies, but many other allies too. And then he's overthrown in a popular uprising. What was that all about?
Well, that took place in as recently as 2011, and the genesis.
Well,
of
Saleh
that,
was in for 33 years.
he was
I
the
think.
longest serving
Yeah.
leader in the Arab world, which itself is quite a feat. He came in to North Yemen in the 70s, and while North Yemen did indeed stabilize under his rule, South Yemen was full of conflicts, including a kind of mini civil war in 1986. The countries decided on unity in 1990 because, hey, Germany was reuniting, this Cold War era was over, and even though the two Yemens that existed between the late 60s and the early 90s, even though they weren't conflicting in the way that the Koreas were, that the Vietnams were, that the Germanys were, they still had a different modus operandi, different alliances. The Soviets were quite close to the South, but that being said, geographically it was quite remote from both the Soviet land space and from the Soviet consciousness, in a way. In 1994, however, just shortly after reunification, the South started demanding that it re-separates from the North, not necessarily for ideological reasons, but for reasons to do with economics. They felt that when Sana'a became the united capital of Yemen, that the South was being neglected. This is one of the many different agitations which has formed this multi-pronged disaster that we see in Yemen today. In 2011, Saleh was ousted and a man called Hadi came in. This was done within the context of this so-called Arab Spring, which we now know to be the Daesh winter. But at the time there was optimism, and many various groups, including some factions of these Houthis, did in fact support the regime change of 2011. Things came to a head when in 2015 the Houthis began to reject the new president Hadi, who once was a close ally of Saleh. This strange dynamic within Yemeni politics.
And both Hadi and Saleh were long-time allies of Saudi Arabia.
Long time.
When Saleh was gravely injured in an earlier part of the conflict, he was flown to Saudi Arabia for medical treatment.
Absolutely, and that's one of the weird aspects of this war, is that you have two presidents with a very similar background who, beginning in 2015, started vying for influence. Even though their ideologies weren't particularly different, they in fact weren't particularly ideological men. Hadi still isn't. He's possibly the least ideological man in the Arab world, insofar as I don't even know if he believes in himself. At least Mohammed bin Salman very much does believe in himself and little else. So the marriage of convenience that we saw between Houthi Shia rebels in the north and former President Saleh simply wanted to get back into power as the president of a united Yemen. He had been in the north since the 70s, the first president of a united Yemen. He clearly wanted more, and as his assassination showed, he may well have been one of the lost men who could have formed a unifying government, because the Houthis in the north, who control the vast majority of Northern Territory, they're not particularly interested in ever having Hadi become the legitimate president of the entire country again. And even in the south, from where Hadi is ruling, the southern movement is now more active than ever. In fact, they've recently changed their name to the Southern Transitional Council, implying that the transition to a re-establishment of southern Yemen is already underway. I personally think that unless some ceasefire agreement comes in, which can satisfy all the incredibly differing sides in this conflict, that splitting it back along the lines that we saw in the 60s will come back into play.
Well, General Mad Dog Mattis, talking softly but carrying a big stick, ordered a ceasefire within 30 days. And in fact, sitting around a peace table. In Sweden, he's even identified the location. He's going to look pretty foolish if within 30 days none of that happens.
Very much so, and I think that we can't ignore the fact that the reason that the US is saying this is because it took the death of one Saudi journalist to make the suffering and deaths of millions of Yemenis become relevant in terms of permeating the American consciousness. Likewise, Imran Khan, the new and very promising Pakistani Prime Minister, has offered his country's role as a neutral mediator in Yemen. Ultimately, though, I think whoever mediates, whether it's Mattis getting his ceasefire in, whether it's Pakistan bringing all the various sides to the table, I can't see how Saudi Arabia would let an independent North Yemen be run by people who are friendly with Iran. Yet at the same time, the Saudi ally, the United Arab Emirates, are saying Hadi's a failure, we're going to back the Southerners, the Southern Transitional Movement.
Yep. So this play is going to run and run. Now, you mentioned Iran. And by the way, the Houthis are not, strictly speaking, Shiites.
Correct.
They're Zaidis.
Yes.
All of them are Zaidis. Even the Muslim Brotherhood are Zaidis. So it's a kind of false dichotomy.
Yes.
The Sunni Shia introduced into the discourse around Yemen to justify a proxy war against Iran. Let's talk about Iran. For most people watching this, Iran is the Ayatollahs. If they're old enough to remember, it's the Ayatollah Khomeini returning from exile in France, a mass revolutionary movement of millions of people on the streets, overthrowing the Shah. Well, who was the Shah? How did he get there? For most people, they're completely unaware that in my own lifetime, Britain overthrew a secular, democratic, socialist prime minister and introduced the Shah, thus throwing a pebble in a pond which became a tidal wave. Tell us about that.
Indeed, and the genesis of this story happens before your lifetime, but Britain was very much involved. In fact, the very family of the last Shah, Mohammed Pahlavi, they were installed by the British, and that happened in the first of the many coups that Britain would attempt.
Oh, so we installed his father, the Shah.
Indeed.
Ah, okay.
And this happened in
Who was this fellow?
1921.
Was he? Did he have any plausible royal claims?
None at all. And this is something that Iranians today who are in Iran and looking at the Shah, the lost Shah's son, who's running around Beverly Hills, a proper Beverly Hillbilly he is, and he's going around with the royal insignia, acting more royal than the king, but he's in fact far, far less royal, because the genesis of this Pahlavi family, the man was a soldier. The founder of this dynasty was not actually royal. He was a man called Reza Khan, who led something called the Cossack Brigade in Iran. Now, after many centuries of war with Russia, 1828 was a turning point in which the South Caucasus, today what's Armenia and Georgia, Azerbaijan, Nakhichevan, all of these areas went with Russia. And even areas which are now, they've reverted to Eastern Turkey, but were, prior to 1828, Northern Persia or Iran, they became Russian. And so it became very obvious to a Sikh Qajar dynasty, who were actually royals, that they needed to modernize. And as Russia was a very close neighbor, a rival, and a country with a more modern army, they decided to form something called a Cossack Brigade, which was in its initial days trained by Russian Cossack warriors who were very good fighters. In the early 20th century, Iran experienced a minor parliamentary revolution, and the first parliament that modern Iran had formed in 1906. Later on, we have another much more seismic revolution in 1917 in Russia, and because of this we see the establishment of the Persian Soviet Socialist Republic, where Bolsheviks actually formed their own pro-Soviet state in northern Iran. This worried Britain in many ways more than it worried Iran, which was just at this point trying to hold itself together. So the British therefore looked to this man, Reza Khan, who led the Cossack Brigade in the early 1920s, and they had him march on Tehran, march on the capital, and say, I'm appointing my men in Prime Minister, forget parliamentary elections, we're in charge of the government, and the Qajar dynasty just sort of hung on by a thread. In 1925, the coup that began in 21 was complete when Reza Khan became Reza Pahlavi Shah, the king, the monarch of Iran. Now, Britain wasn't done with him yet. The Lord's giveth and they taketh away, but so do the imperialists. Because in 1941, when Britain's best friend from the 20s became friends with Adolf Hitler in the 1940s, the Soviets and the British, who both occupied parts of Iran, said that this man has to go. They didn't want to overthrow the regime itself because, much like the Emperor of Japan, who was allowed to reign after 1945 by Douglas MacArthur, the American general, they thought that this Pahlavi dynasty, which was quite fake from the beginning, it needed to at least have some time to grow and at least pretend legitimacy. So they put in a man in 1941 who ended up being the last of the Shahs, and this was Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the man who reigned from 41 until 1979.
He was the son of the former.
The son of the former, yes.
Yeah. So he is in power. How do we get to Mossadegh?
We get to Mossadegh because of this parliament established in 1906. And as Iran becomes more and more modern, albeit slowly, gradualism in first gear, we can put it that way, we see the post-war election of Mohammad Mossadegh as prime minister. Now, this man was a progressive. He was anti-communist. He was anti-clerical, although he was very effective in his early days at balancing the forces of the Communist Party of Iran.
Who was strong. The Tudeh party was always strong.
Formed incidentally by the Soviets in 1946 when briefly the Soviets established an Azerbaijani Soviet Republic in northern Iran, which is today once again the Azerbaijan province of Iran, and they also established a Soviet autonomous, independent Kurdish state, but those only lasted for 1 year. They began in 46, they were gone by 47. So in the early 50s, Mossadegh realized that Iran could transform itself, it could modernize, and for that it needed money. To get money, you need to sell oil, and voila, there's plenty of oil and gas in Iran. There was
Except
then.
Someone else owns them.
That was the problem.
Yeah.
And that was what the root of Mossadegh's personal problems was. He wanted to audit a company called Anglo-Iranian Petroleum, a company which today is known as BP.
Yeah.
They didn't want that because they had this mentality, much like...
It was owned by the British state, wasn't it?
Yes, at that time it was nationalized, I believe, by the Labour government. And so, if I'm not mistaken, and so what we're seeing here is Britain putting its foot down. This was when Churchill was back in power, and say, we're not going to allow Iran to audit the company. And then Mossadegh said, well, I'm going to nationalize this company. It's on Iranian soil, and anyone on Iranian soil needs to obey Iranian law. And as Prime Minister, I'm the Iranian lawmaker. They didn't react well. In fact, they took it very badly. And Britain for a while had been sort of chomping at the bit, Churchill in particular, to have the Americans go in. And it wasn't until Harry Truman was replaced as the US president by Dwight D. Eisenhower, an old friend of Churchill from the Second World War days, that the CIA launched something called Operation Ajax. This was an overt coup against Mossadegh. A man called Kermit Roosevelt, the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, organized the entire thing. They sent agitators to Iran. They paid for protesters against Mossadegh. They even paid some of his supporters to clash with the protesters just to give it that aroma of authenticity. And the result was that after a period of indecision, the still fairly young and fresh-faced Shah decided to dismiss his prime minister, and he was subsequently subject to house arrest, where he died several years later. This incident burned into the collective memory of all Iranians, whether they were communists, whether they were progressives, whether they were moderate Shahist supporters of a constitutional monarchy, or whether they were conservative Islamist clerics. And it was these factions combined that led to the overthrow of the Shah in 79, just after he spent most of the country's money, wasted it some would say, on throwing the biggest party the world had ever seen in 1971 to celebrate the 2,500 year of the Iranian Empire, which would end in his very lifetime several years later.
And of course, the overthrow of Mossadegh, the reinstatement of absolutism in the form of the Shah, gave rise to the Islamic Revolution, as you say, and everything that happened next. The Islamic Revolution gave rise to the Iran-Iraq War in 1980. The Iran-Iraq War gave rise to the Iraq-Kuwait affair, and thus the first war on Iraq, which then gave rise to the second, which has given rise to so much bloodshed. In the few minutes left to us, where else would you like to take us?
I'd like to end with Yugoslavia, because that was something that was in the very conscious lifetime of both of us, and it's a war crime that is hardly ever discussed. The genesis of the breakup of Yugoslavia goes back to 1986, where young Serbs at the Serbian Academy for Arts and Sciences drafted a memorandum complaining that minority groups within regions of the Serbian part of Yugoslavia have political autonomy, but this didn't apply to Serbs living in places like Croatia or Bosnia. This SONU memorandum, as it was called, was condemned by a loyal communist called Slobodan Milosevic in the 80s. But by 1989-1990, he was leading what was called an anti-bureaucratic revolution, which tended to side with the kind of grievances of this SONU memorandum. Of course, in the early 90s, seizing on what began as minor grievances, albeit important ones, the major European powers, Germany, France, and Britain, started pouring money and arms into various groups that previously had no real grievances against each other. The only difference between a Bosniak, a Croat, and a Serb is religion. They're the same ethnicity, and they're all quite secular people, albeit with religious traditions. Europe lit an absolute match under gunpowder. We had already seen the Balkans cause the First World War, and Yugoslavia was a quite successful multicultural federation. Europe, though, wanted to destroy the last truly non-aligned economy in Europe, as Tito, the great founder of socialist Yugoslavia, was also a founder of the non-aligned movement. Ironically, in 1995, Milosevic appeared in Ohio, in the United States, signing these Dayton Accords, which ended the wars that saw Serbs fighting Croats and Bosnians. But the West wasn't done yet. The rump that remained of Yugoslavia in 1999 was attacked, and the leaders of the attack were Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, but the credit for this malicious attack on the former Yugoslavia really can be put at the feet of Tony Blair. It was this war where Tony Blair cut his teeth and tasted blood for the first time. And it was that taste of blood which led him to become the kind of mouthpiece to very big and very disastrous on the scale of millions wars in the 21st century, most notably Iraq. So when one looks at all of the wars going on today, whether Syria, whether Yemen, whether the prolonged conflict in Iraq, the modern notion of neo-imperialism, that time when the old imperialism that we saw in Aden becomes the neo-imperialism we say today, that happened in Yugoslavia, particularly in 1999, and Tony Blair is the author of that disaster.
It was a dress rehearsal. That's the basis on which I opposed it in Parliament at the time, under the leadership of Mr. Benn, God rest his soul. We fought hard, most of us, against the war on Yugoslavia, not just because Yugoslavia was a matter of affection for us, Tito, a matter of great admiration, a great hero in the socialist pantheon, not only because we didn't want to see the ethnic breakup, further balkanization of the Balkans, but because we knew that once the Americans and the British got the taste for blood, once they had theorized it in this RTP, right to protect, arrogated to themselves the entirely unlawful concept that they had the right to intervene in civil conflicts, many of which they themselves had fomented. That was the road to hell. And so indeed it turned out to be. We'll return, no doubt, to where that road went in subsequent editions. Adam, you are a font of erudition, of knowledge and eloquence. I've been George Galloway.
I've been Adam Garrett.
We've been the History Boys.